All right, good morning, everyone. So I hope everybody remembered to do the Judaism online quiz, which is due right now at the start of class. That was 5 multiple choice questions based on my third lecture on Judaism. And in that lecture, we explored the development of what we call rabbinic Judaism, that is Judaism as we know it today, out of the earlier Pharisaic tradition. The Pharisees were one of the 4 main factions that we talked about that existed in the first century during the time of Roman rule in Judea. And we described the failed Jewish revolt that resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple and how the only group left standing was the Pharisees. And so it's the Pharisees that dictate the subsequent direction of Judaism as a religion. And that is Judaism as we know it today, or what's called rabbinic Judaism. And for the rest of that lecture, we really focused on Jewish practice, right? We went through different subjects. We talked about, for example, prayer. We talked about dietary law. We talked about some purification rituals like the use of a mikvah. We talked about observing the Sabbath. And today, we're going to talk about the Jewish community after the first century. So once you get beyond the first century of the Common Era, the story of Judaism until you get to the 20th century, and we'll be talking about that in my last lecture on Judaism on Friday, the story of Judaism is the story of the diaspora. That is the dispersal of the Jewish community throughout initially the Mediterranean world, but also far beyond it as well. When we went through the material for the first few lectures, we really talked about Judea and Jerusalem a lot, okay? But the story today is going to be about the practice of Judaism, the existence of Jewish communities as minorities in other parts of the world where they are subject to the dictates of non-Jewish rulers. And so this is a story that is often filled with episodes of persecution and even acts of genocide. It's a very difficult story, and that'll set the stage for us in our exploration of modern Judaism on Friday. And there is a short article I'd like you to have a look at in the assigned readings folder. It's about, the official title is like Jewish Identities After the Holocaust. So have a look at that. It's only like, I think, 3 pages long, but that'll give you a preview of some of the issues and some of the complexities of modern Jewish identity that we'll unpack in my lecture on Friday. No one's here, so I think it's safe that I can remove my mask and be able to vocalize a bit better. I'll put it back on if anyone shows up, but of course I'm in a new room, so if anyone did try to come to class, they're probably confused as to my location. Hopefully they check into the video stream and see the message there in the live chat that I'm in wall 307, which is just down the hall from our classroom. Usually it's on the end that's closer to AOC 2, which is where my office is held. All right, so we begin our lecture today talking about the diaspora. And I think I've used that term in the context of some other religions. I think I talked about the modern migration of, for example, Hindus to places like the UK and to the United States as a Hindu diaspora. But that term is most closely associated with the Jewish community. Right? This dispersal, this migration of Jews leaving Canaan, leaving Israel, Judea, Palestine, and moving to other parts of the world. We can only see this process beginning back at the time of the Babylonian exile, right? This period in the 6th century BCE where large number of Jews are taken into Babylon, or what is now Iraq, and they live, and some, of course, stay. The Persians allow the return to occur, but some people stay in Babylon and in Persia and establish Jewish communities there. So we can already begin to talk about the diaspora going back to the 6th century BCE. But it's really once you get past the 1st century, after that disastrous failed revolt against the Romans that concluded in the year 70 with the destruction of the Second Temple, that's when the diaspora really kicks into a kind of high gear, as it were, because the Romans are just increasing their persecution, their intensity, their crackdown on these rebellious Judeans after that. So once we move into the 2nd century of the Common Era, we have an estimated 5 million Jews living outside of Judea, living in places like Egypt, for example, or even faraway places eventually like Spain, really throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, some of that is for economic reasons, right? If you work in business, for example, you might move to different markets and different trade ports, but there's also this persecution factor that the Romans, obviously in the wake of that rebellion, did not look kindly upon the Jews. And there were additional revolts against Roman rule. Another major one was the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba, who some regarded as the long-awaited Messiah from the line of David, who was going to restore the kingdom of Israel and usher in the new age of righteousness and prosperity. But the Bar Kokhba revolt failed as well, a failed messianic movement, and that just increased the crackdown. So you have this dispersal of Jewish communities throughout the world, and wherever these Jewish communities settle themselves, well, then they are now living surrounded by Gentiles meaning non-Jews, who have their own cultures and language and religious traditions, and there is interaction between the two. And I don't just mean in terms of, business, but in terms of a kind of syncretism, a cultural synthesis can occur. And we begin to see new varieties of the Jewish community that, Jews who settle in a place like Spain are influenced by that prevailing culture, and may even develop new traditions and even new languages that are not shared by Jews in other parts of the world. So we can begin to talk about these different regional communities of Jews who come to understand Judaism in some different ways. And that's going to set the stage for some of our discussions on Friday as well. So let's take a look at this map here. So this map is a representation of the early diaspora. Okay, so the diaspora is going to get far greater as the centuries pass, but this is really the initial stage. And you can see the concentration around the coastal lands that surround the Mediterranean. So there's Jerusalem, this is Judea here. This is Mesopotamia or Babylon or Iraq. So this is from the Babylonian exile in the 6th century, and then you have these communities establishing themselves along the coast of this immediate region, like the coast of Egypt, cities like Alexandria, and then with time, a greater expanse reaching across North Africa in the regions of, this is Tunisia here, this is Algeria, Morocco is over here, and this is Spain. We also have another group here suggesting the settlement of Jews up in Britain even. So depending on where the Jews settled during this diaspora period, they're surrounded by different peoples with different religions, different languages, different cultures, and that has an impact on the Jewish communities there as well. Broadly speaking, for the sake of convenience, we're going to talk about two major diaspora groups. And those are the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. And what I'm doing with this category of Sephardim is something that other scholars do. I'm grouping another group, the Mizrahi. These are the Eastern Jews, the Jews who settled in places like Iraq and Persia, in with the Sephardim. Okay, and we could also talk about the Jews of Yemen. We could group them in with the Mizrahi, group them in with the Sephardim as well. So we're basically going to focus on these two regional categories, and you'll understand why as I explain them: the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. So these, properly speaking, aren't different sects of Judaism in the way we think of, for example, Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists, or Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians. These are mainly cultural designations having to do with the regions of the world where they settled and the type of local cultural developments that occur. Now, there are some variations in practice of the religion of Judaism, but it's mainly a cultural distinction more so than a sectarian distinction. Okay, so let's unpack these concepts a little bit. The first of the two groups, the Ashkenazim, this refers to the Jews that settled in Central Europe. And more, with time, there's some population movements. So this would also include those Jews who move westward into places like France or even Britain, and most definitely, and this is the region that it's most closely associated with, those Jews who settled in Eastern Europe, extending into Russia as well. So Jews in places like the Ukraine and Poland, these are all Ashkenazi Jews, the Ashkenazim, these European Jews. Now, the story of the Ashkenazim, as I'll explain in today's lecture, is greatly impacted by the fact that in Europe, a new religion would come to dominate, and that religion is Christianity. And in Christianity, as I'll go into in a little bit more detail, this is particularly true of earlier understandings of Christianity. There's a very hostile attitude towards Judaism, that those who continue to practice Judaism after the time of Jesus were all those who rejected Jesus and had even, according to this viewpoint, had even participated in the killing of Jesus. And so the Christian majorities often persecuted Ashkenazi Jews, the Jews of Europe, as being anti-Christian, as being the killers of Christ. And so the story of the Ashkenazim is largely one of anti-Semitism and persecution, with some exceptions, but that really dominates the story. And that leads to, once we get to the modern period, our subject on Friday, the migration to the United States and also the creation of a new state in the Middle East for Jews, principally escaping persecution, and that is the state of Israel, founded in 1948 out of what was the British Mandate of Palestine. So we'll talk about that on Friday. The other group here is the Sephardim. So this term, Sephardim, initially referred to the Jews who settled in Spain, and then more broadly, as there were some population movements, also include the Jews of North Africa. And I mentioned this other category, Mizrahi. We're going to group the Mizrahi Jews in with them. So we're going to say Sephardim refers to Spain, North Africa, as well as the Middle East, or more broadly, what would become, when Islam begins in the 7th century, the Muslim majority world. So you can think of these two regional groups of Jews, the Ashkenazim being those living under Christians, and the Sephardim being those living under Muslims. And depending on those contexts, it has an impact on the lived realities of those communities. In contrast to the Ashkenazi community, the Sephardic community had an easier time. That compared to the Ashkenazi story, the Sephardic story is largely one of prosperity, but there are still episodes of persecution and conflict as well. It's hardly free from that, but relative to the Ashkenazi experience, it's certainly a better one, a story of greater prosperity and success. Now, as we'll discuss in my last lecture on Judaism on Friday, there's a dramatic change in the 20th century. When this new state is created in 1948 in the Middle East, principally by Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardic Jews also face the hostilities that are started as a result of the creation of this state. And so what you see in, for example, the Arab world is this sudden growth of intensely anti-Jewish hostilities. Right? And sometimes it's more refined to say anti-Zionist in the sense of opposing this particular political movement that created Israel. But I would tell you from some firsthand experience that it spills over into outright anti-Semitism as well, and even lifts some of the anti-Semitic ideas that originated in Europe into the Arab and Muslim world as well. So we see this dramatic change in the 20th century. And again, we'll look at that on Friday. In this map, we can see some color-coded regions that give us an idea of where we find these different regional communities. So the blue here represents the Ashkenazim, the Ashkenazi Jews. So the term Ashkenaz originally refers to Germany, but it comes to refer to this whole region as well, including the Russian Empire. Then I guess this is kind of a pink color here. This is the Sephardim, so initially Spain, but then all of North Africa as well. And you can see that Turkey is included. And one of the reasons why, as I'll mention, is because when Catholic armies from the north conquered the Muslim kingdoms in Spain in 1492, the last kingdom falls, the Jews who flee Spain, the Sephardic Jews, are allowed to resettle in the Muslim Ottoman Empire. And so they end up going to places like Istanbul, for example, in Turkey. This map is using green to indicate the Mizrahi, and what I'm doing is lumping the Mizrahi in with the Sephardim. You can see too that they have the new state of Israel, founded in 1948, in blue here, associating it with the Ashkenazim. So Israel is founded by Ashkenazim. For example, Theodor Herzl is from Hungary. He's not a founder, but he's the father of Zionism. But then we will have a migration of Sephardic Jews to Israel. So Israel isn't a strictly Ashkenazi state. You have lots of Sephardim, you have Mizrahi, you have Ethiopian Jews there as well. So let's look at some more details regarding these different communities. So I mentioned that this Hebrew word Ashkenaz originally referred to Germany, so referring to the Jews who settled in Central Europe in Germany, but that term comes to refer to a far greater region of Europe, excluding Spain, right? That's Sephardim, but everywhere else in Europe, those are Ashkenazi Jews. So these Jews are influenced by the European Christian cultures and communities around them, like French Catholics, German Lutherans, Russian Orthodox Christians. They're shaped by those cultures. And that extends into even sort of mundane things like traditional foods, the way people dress, all these types of things that has an impact. So one of the things that we see, Christianity develops in the Roman Empire, and the Romans were monogamous. You could have concubines, but you couldn't have more than one wife. So when Christianity develops in the Roman Empire, Christianity is a monogamous religious tradition that you can only have one spouse. For the most part, there are some offshoots of Christianity that dabble in polygamy. But in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, polygamy is allowed. But the Ashkenazi Jews living in monogamous Europe, the rabbis in that community reject polygamy. So polygamy disappears from the Ashkenazi Jewish community, but it continues in the Sephardic community. All right, so there's one difference. We can see the adoption of European styles of dress. And in a few moments, I'm going to tell you about a new sect of Judaism that develops in Europe among the Ashkenazim called the Hasidim. And the Hasidim wear these very distinctive outfits that are rooted in 18th century European style of dress, right? It doesn't look Middle Eastern at all. So we can see the influence of European culture on styles of dress, on cuisine. Intermarriages do take place, right? The ideal is that you are to marry within the Jewish community, but human beings are complex and circumstances happen as they will. So there is some intermarriage that goes on there as well. And we also see the emergence of a new Jewish language. So the language of the Torah is Hebrew. The language of the Tanakh, by and large, is Hebrew. There's some Aramaic sections. By the time you get to the Roman period, the prevailing colloquial language that Jews are speaking in Judea or in the Galilee, for example, where Yeshua or Jesus of Nazareth comes from, is Aramaic. So Aramaic by that time is the spoken language. Hebrew is a liturgical language. And what you find developing among the Ashkenazim is this new language that mixes Hebrew with German. And this language is called Yiddish. So Yiddish was the predominant language of the Ashkenazim for centuries, but in modern times, it is dying out steadily. And one of the few communities that still uses it is the Hasidim. And I'll tell you again about the Hasidim in a moment. But even the Hasidim in Israel, because they consider Hebrew to be the sacred language of the Torah, for everyday conversation, they use Yiddish rather than classical Hebrew, whereas Hebrew is the official state language of the modern state of Israel. So there is some movement in the Ashkenazi community in different parts of Europe. Part of that is because people are escaping persecution and certain rulers decide to crack down on the Jews in certain times. For example, when the Crusades start, while the Crusaders are traveling to the Middle East to fight Muslims, they actually stop and slaughter Ashkenazi Jews in Europe along the way. They also end up fighting with Orthodox Christians as well when they go there. So there is some movement. And when we get to the beginning of the 20th century, the country that has the largest Jewish community in Europe at that time is actually the Russian Empire. and about 5 million Ashkenazi Jews in the Russian Empire at the start of the 20th century. But then just over the course of that century, there's going to be another dramatic shift. We'll have mass migration to the United States. And today we have the second largest Jewish community in the world in the United States. And then we have the creation of the state of Israel. And you have this mass migration of European Jews to the Middle East to become citizens of this new state. And so while you have this large community at the beginning of the 20th century in the Russian Empire, by the time you get to the end of the 20th century, the Russian population has dramatically shrunk, and the American and the Israeli Jewish populations have shot up into the millions. So I mentioned that the story of Ashkenazi Jews is one filled with stories of persecution and hardship, of facing anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism refers broadly to anti-Jewish prejudice, and that can include simple bigotry and discrimination, and move all the way into acts of violence and even genocide. And there are sadly some old anti-Semitic tropes that still circulate in our world today that accuse Jews of being involved in vast conspiracies to take over a country, a government, a world, to manipulate and control things. This trope of a Jewish puppet master, right? That there's Jews behind all these things going on in the world. And of course, that stuff is then used to incite violence, mass murder of Jews, right? It's that type of sentiment that led to the Holocaust in Europe in the middle of the 20th century that resulted in the systematic mass murder of 6 million Jews. Just horrific. So anti-Semitism is something that everyone needs to take very seriously, and we can see the way it shaped Ashkenazi history and culture in Europe. There are some direct connections to Christianity here. Now, anti-Semitism isn't unique to Christianity. It existed before Christianity, and it exists in other religious contexts. I mentioned the existence of anti-Semitism in Muslim communities, but there's definitely a Christian religious dimension that enhanced anti-Semitic views. When we learn about Christianity, after we finish our study of Judaism, so next Monday, we'll learn about this Jewish preacher from Nazareth. That's one of the sad ironies of anti-Semitism in Christian communities, of course, is that Christians worship Jesus, who was Jewish, and at the same time exhibit this hostility towards Jews. It's this bizarre contradiction. But in the story of Jesus, he is rejected by and large by the Jewish community, right? He has his followers, but most people reject him, and he ends up being executed by the Romans. And according to the Christian accounts in the New Testament, the Jewish authorities play a part in this, right? And they encourage the Roman authorities to kill Jesus. There's the part where, for example, the Roman Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, says, I'll free one of these two men. I've got this murderer over here, Barabbas, or I've got Jesus. And the crowd, the Jewish crowd, according to the New Testament, chooses to free the murderer rather than Jesus, and they call for him to be crucified. So those types of stories in the Christian text inflame anti-Jewish sentiment in Christian Europe, and they portray Jews as being the killers of Christ. And of course, Christ wasn't just a human being in Christianity, he was the incarnation of God on earth. So in essence, they're accusing Jews of committing deicide. Deicide means you killed God, right? That's quite an allegation. And of being agents of the devil, agents of the Antichrist. And this continued to the point where once you get to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, you have people like Luther in Germany who is calling for synagogues to be burned down and things like that. That Jews, by virtue of the fact that they reject Christ and aren't Christians, are the agents of the devil. And so you have all these various outbreaks of persecution, and you could understand how a bad politician, a bad king, might redirect the anger towards him by blaming problems in society on this vulnerable minority, the Jews. Even the Black Plague was blamed on Jews. European Christian rulers made accusations that Jews were poisoning wells, and that was the source of the bubonic plague that was sweeping throughout Europe. So This has a huge impact on the Ashkenazi Jewish experience. They do not have the same rights as anyone else. They have to live in these segregated, enclosed neighborhoods, these ghettos. They are not allowed, in some instances, it varies on country and ruler, but for example, to buy land. So Jews are excluded from, for example, working in agriculture in some settings. If you can't buy land and grow crops, then what do? Well, one area of life would be to be a merchant, right? To engage in business and trade. And if you're a merchant, you could also travel more readily, right? If you have like a caravan, you take your goods to a new market. And if you're being persecuted, you might have to move a lot. And so that begins Jewish involvement in finance in Europe during this period as well. As time passes and we get to the modern age, the emergence of new secular political systems in the post-Enlightenment period in Europe are strongly supported by Jews because they see secularism as a new way of governance that will grant them equal rights. That according to a secular nationalist political philosophy, if you live in France and you speak French, you're French. And it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, everyone is French, regardless of religion, or even if you don't have a religion, and everyone will have the same rights. Right? That's the ideal, at least. And so many Jews in Europe from the Ashkenazi community became staunch supporters of various secular systems, including Marxism, by the way, right? Because they saw this persecution rooted in religious convictions. And so a new secular age or a Marxist system may allow for equality of the Jewish minorities. That hope, of course, was severely dashed by the outbreak of the Second World War, where the rise of this fascist government under Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party unleashed the Holocaust. This systematic genocide where Jews, wherever the Nazis ruled, right? So not just Germany, but then they conquer Poland, for example, they round up all the Jews or even people who are, considered to be friendly or influenced by Jews, and they bring them to death camps where they're systematically executed through gassing, through firing squads, or often just starved to death in the process as well. And so in the aftermath of this horrific act of genocide, in the midst of the modern era, which had initially held so much promise, people began to rethink the future of Jewish existence in Europe. And for some, the answer is only that Jews will only be safe if they have their own state with their own army. And thus you see some of the roots of the state of Israel, this idea that Jews will only be safe if they have their own state, their own army, their own government. So long as they continue to exist as minorities in the diaspora, they will always be vulnerable. So it was among the Ashkenazi Jews that we see a new sect of Judaism emerge. This sect is called the Hasidim, or Hasidic Judaism. The founder of this new sect of Judaism this is a drawing of him, of what he might have looked like. He was called the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov, this is an honorary title. That name means the master of the good name. Baal Shem Tov was a kind of Jewish saint. He was a preacher and a storyteller and a mystic, someone who is reported to have performed healings on people. And he emphasized the importance of an inner dimension to Judaism. That we know, as we discussed in the third lecture, that in Judaism, there's a lot of emphasis, or specifically rabbinic Judaism, there's a lot of emphasis on outward observance of all the commandments, all the different mitzvahs derived from the Torah and the Talmud, according to the rabbis. You dress this way, you eat this food and not that food, you pray 3 times a day, you adhere to all these rules. And you could understand how, with that emphasis, inner dimensions could be vulnerable to getting lost in it. Right? That people are so concerned with outward rituals and how you tie the tefillin and the length of the beard and all those types of outer things that you might lose some of the inner dimensions of religion. But the Baal Shem Tov places renewed emphasis on the inner dimensions. He talks about cultivating certain human virtues that devout Jews have to manifest in their observance of the outer dimensions of Judaism. So he talks about, for example, the importance of having joy in your heart. That if you do not pray with joy in your heart, with that happiness, that enthusiasm, that love for Hashem, for Yahweh, for God, then your prayers are empty. They're like an empty bag. They're just this outer layer. And when he conveys these lessons to people, he communicates them in a way that people can understand. He uses stories, for example. And this was different than the way that the rabbis at the time were communicating knowledge of Judaism. They were very legalistic in their explanations, right? They're coming from the rabbinic academies and trained in this particular way of legal reasoning and interpretation of the text. If you're not privy to that type of education, those types of teachings are kind of obtuse, right? You can't really engage them, but the Baal Shem Tov is communicating that knowledge in a much more accessible way. And so he builds a following. People are attracted to this charismatic healer and preacher, this sort of saint living amongst them. And keep in mind, right, that this is among the Ashkenazi community. This is among a community that has faced a great deal of persecution and hardship, a lot of gloom in their life. And here comes this preacher who's talking about having joy and singing with joy amidst all that struggle and all that darkness. So he earns a following, and the Jews who adopt his understanding of Judaism come to be referred as the Hasidim, which means the pious ones. Those who emphasize this inner piety, these inner virtues. And other chief disciples of the Baal Shem Tov exist in other parts of, initially places like Poland, but then into Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe and other Ashkenazi communities. And those leaders come to be revered as sort of living saints as well. And they believe that these living saints, these mystics, have a special innate inner connection to God, and that connection even survives after they die. And so people would then go and visit their graves and pray for intercession with God among these important holy men. Now, the initial response among the non-Hasidic rabbis was one of hostility. They're saying, wait a minute, why are you listening to these guys? We're the ones who have spent all our lives studying Torah and Talmud and are carrying on the lineage of the ancient rabbis. It's our knowledge, our authority that is supreme, not theirs. So there's initially a friction, but over time, the two become synthesized together. And so the Hasidim are among the most devout Orthodox practitioners of Judaism. That is, that in addition to all this emphasis on inner dimensions, they are the most strict, most rigorous in their adherence to all the outer dimensions as well, albeit the outer dimensions as they were interpreted in places like 18th century Poland, right? So it takes on this distinctive regional flair. Now, in response to the experience of persecution of Jews in Europe, the prevailing view among the Hasidim was that we need to close ourselves off from non-Jews, from the non-Jewish society, from the Christians. So they adopted the approach of insularity, of being insular. That means being closed off, right? Staying out of the affairs of the outside world. So that means that among the Hasidim, for example, they use Yiddish. That if you're Hasidic Jews and you live in, let's say, New York City, the first language, your primary language, even though you live in the United States, where English is the predominant language, Yiddish is your first language. And you have some English that you acquire, that you might use in some circumstances. But this is an aspect of that insularity. And you have your own schools, and you only marry within the community. And you support only other Hasidic businesses unless you have to work with other people. So there's this real insularity to the Hasidic community and this distrust of the outside world, that the Gentile world is a danger, is a threat, and so you really need to cut yourself off from it. Here we can see some images of contemporary Hasidic Jews. Have a look at this image over here. This is an image of American Hasidic Jews in New York City. And note the distinctive style of dress. We have these fur hats. People in the hot Middle East don't wear fur hats. So why are they wearing fur hats? Well, because this is what they wore in Poland in the 18th century. Right? It's cold there. And so there are these distinctive styles of dress that originate with the first Hasids in Eastern Europe, these Ashkenazi communities that still carry over to this day. So in their distinctive style of dress, in their distinctive neighborhoods, the Hasidic community is like a community within a community, right? That they are these closed off areas of places like New York City that have their own language, their own way of doing things, closed off from the rest of the city. Here you can see a Hasidic man praying at the tomb of a tzaddik, which is a righteous person, a Hasidic saint. Now, there are different factions of Hasidic communities, and one of the most important is Chabad. So Chabad means wisdom, but there's another term for the Chabad Hasidic movement, and that is the Lubavitchers. And they're called the Lubavitchers is because this particular branch of Hasidic Judaism originated in the town of Lubavitch in Russia in the 18th century. And so they're still associated with that point of origin. However, today in the 21st century, that community is now centered here in the United States. This migration, this escape from persecution in Russia to the religious freedom of the United States. And so the largest Lubavitcher or Chabad community is in Brooklyn. And there are whole sections of New York City, of Brooklyn, where it's all Hasidim. And the Chabad movement has their distinctive line of chief rabbis, or in Yiddish, the word rabbi is Rebbe. So in Hasidic circles, they tend to be called the Rebbe. And the seventh Rebbe or rabbi of the Chabad Hasidic movement was Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and that's him right there. And he is a figure of immense popularity among Chabad followers, so much so that there's actually a faction of Chabad devotees who believe that the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson was the awaited Mashiach, that he was the Messiah. And here you can see some Lubavitchers waving a flag that says Mashiach on it. This is the Yiddish variant of the word, because these guys believe that the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson was the Messiah, that he has come, and so they're celebrating. That's not held by all members of Chabad, but there is that faction. Now, the significance of the Chabad movement is that they build these institutes called Chabad houses throughout the world. And the point of these is to reach out to secular Jews who aren't particularly religious, and try and get them to re-embrace traditional religious orthodoxy. So if you're an American Jew who doesn't do the daily prayers, doesn't keep kosher, maybe goes to synagogue on Yom Kippur, but other than that isn't particularly religious, Chabad will provide outreach to invite you to come to their institute and wear tefillin and become more observant in your practice. Chabad institutes are found all over the world, including right here in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So here's a group of Lubavitcher or Chabad Hasidim, all men in this picture, with a portrait of the seventh Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, at the Chabad Institute of Myrtle Beach. So you could go and visit the Chabad Institute if you were so inclined to do so. This is a video I don't have time to share with you today, but it's about the insular Ashkenazi Hasidic communities in New York City. So let's talk about the Sephardim now. We have explored the Ashkenazi Jewish community and discussed how the Hasidic branch of Jewish Orthodoxy emerged among the Hasidim, among the Ashkenazi. So now let's talk about the other main geographic cultural group, the Sephardim. So the Hebrew word Sepharad originally referred to Spain, as I mentioned, but in time it would come to refer to not only Jews that settled in Spain, but also throughout North Africa, and more broadly, the Jews who lived in what would become Muslim majority countries or Muslim ruled countries. So that would include, the Arabic-speaking nations of like Egypt, of North Africa. And then, as I said, I'm grouping the Mizrahi Jews in with this camp as well. So we're told that when the Muslim forces from the Maghreb, from North Africa, conquered Al-Andalus, or Spain, there's a Germanic tribe who ruled Spain at the time, I forget, in the year 711, that as the Muslims conquered and defeated the Roman Catholic forces, they would then arm the Jewish minorities in the towns to guard the sites they conquered as the Muslim army advanced. So the Jews helped to work with the Muslim armies as they conquered Spain and even reached all the way to southern France. So in the ensuing centuries, what we see is that the Sephardic Jews, the Jews of Spain, begin to adopt Arabic as a language of not only day-to-day life, but also in scholarship. So you find Jewish texts being written in Arabic, and also a hybrid language that mixed Hebrew with Spanish, which is called Ladino. And Ladino is really dying out. There are still, like, the Hasidim still speak Yiddish, but Ladino is far more rare. When in 1492, the last surviving Muslim kingdom in southern Spain was conquered by the forces of Ferdinand and Isabella, from the north, the remaining Muslims and Jews in Spain were given a choice. They could either go into exile, convert to Roman Catholicism, or try and fight and die in the process. So some Jews and Muslims left Spain and generally resettled in North Africa, places like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, but others stayed and outwardly converted. And so then you have the ongoing existence of quote unquote secret Jews and secret Muslims, people who are outwardly, they've been baptized as Roman Catholics, so they say they're Catholics, but in the privacy of their homes, they still observe Judaism or they still observe Islam. And the existence of those communities is what leads to the Spanish Inquisition, that is putting people on trial to see whether they're true Catholics, but they're still secretly Jewish, and various persecutions then. So with people fleeing the Catholic conquest or the Inquisition, you have this resettlement, and one region that invited the arrival of Sephardic Jews was the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire centered in what is now Turkey. And so you see the relocation of Sephardic Jews to places like Istanbul there, which again adds to the broader categorization of Sephardic Judaism as beyond Spain. So for the period between the 6th century to the 11th century, the most important centers of Jewish learning in the world were located in the Middle East, in what would become the Abbasid Caliphate. So the Abbasid Caliphate was a Muslim empire that existed from 750 to 1258. In 750, the Abbasids defeated another Muslim empire called the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyad Caliphate had succeeded an even earlier caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate. And so the Abbasids then conquered the Umayyads. And these two stars here symbolize the two preeminent Talmudic academies, or yeshivas, in the world. So this was the place where if Jews had any questions about how to live according to Jewish law, halakha, and it wasn't already answered somewhere in a text, they would consult the rabbis of these academic institutions. And so these were the prevailing institution in Judaism at that time under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliph of Sunni Islam. That's a nice segue to look briefly at what a yeshiva is. So the term yeshiva refers to a Talmudic academy, a rabbinic academy, where someone trains in the study and the interpretation of Torah, of Tanakh, of the Talmud, in order to be able to formulate halakha, Jewish law. And here you can see a number of rabbinic students here. They've got these vast texts, probably of Talmud in front of them, and they'll listen to lectures by different rabbis, professors, and they're training to officially be ordained as rabbis. The term yeshiva can also be used more broadly. So sometimes you'll even see like a Jewish day school for elementary school kids referred to as a yeshiva, but more precisely, it refers to an academy to train as a rabbi. one of the study methods, one of the pedagogical techniques used in a yeshiva is study pairs. So in these images, you can see that the students have paired off with each other. And what they're doing is they're taking rival rabbinic arguments and they're participating in a deliberate argument over a particular rabbinic position. So if, for example, this particular rabbi 1,000 years ago argued that you're supposed to do this, and then another rabbi dissented and said, no, it should be done this way, they are honing their logic and their rhetorical skills by basically rehashing that argument and arguing for the side. Even if they don't believe in that position, they're participating in the argument. That's a traditional method of rabbinic training. So as I said before, when we talked about the rabbis, historically, these sorts of institutes were only for men, but when we get to the modern period, which we'll talk about on Friday, then you begin to see women admitted, and you see women training as rabbis as well in the modern period. Really, from the 1970s on is when that really starts to take shape. So it was in the Sephardic community that we see the emergence of one of the greatest Jewish thinkers that ever lived. No disrespect to any other great Jewish thinkers like Rashi, for example, but Maimonides is one of the greatest Jewish thinkers, the greatest rabbis of all time. And he was originally from Spain. So he was born into Spain when it was part of the Muslim world, when it was ruled by Muslims. However, there was a changeover in the Muslim rulers, and the new Muslim rulers who took over were far less tolerant than the previous rulers. And so Maimonides' family left Spain and resettled in Muslim North Africa, eventually finding their way to Egypt. And in Egypt, Maimonides, who, in addition to being a rabbi, was a man of, he was a Renaissance man, basically, right? He studied all these different things. So one of the areas he also was skilled in was medicine and medical knowledge. And so in Cairo, in Egypt, which at the time was part of the Ayyubid Sultanate, and at the time, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who's known in the West as Saladin, famous for defeating the Crusaders and expelling them from Jerusalem. Saladin, this Muslim sultan, appoints Maimonides, this Jewish scholar, this rabbi, as his personal physician. So Maimonides becomes the personal doctor to the Ayyubid Sultan Saladin. And while he's there, he's also producing great scholarship. He's writing many works. He writes in Arabic in addition to Hebrew. So if you want to study Maimonides, learning Arabic would be appropriate for that. And Maimonides existing in a society where you have Muslims, of course, but you also have Coptic Christians, that is the Egyptian traditional form of Christianity, and Jews, begins to articulate some standard views about what is Judaism and how it is distinct from Islam and Christianity in terms of its beliefs. And he's also engaging with all of the latest intellectual disciplines at the time. So he's engaging with Muslim philosophers and Christian philosophers who are building off the Greek tradition. He's in this very rich cosmopolitan environment. One of the texts that he produces during this period is the 13 Articles of Faith, where he lays out the 13 core beliefs that Jews must adhere to. So thus far, we've talked a lot about Jewish practice, about all the different rules that you're supposed to follow. But we haven't talked that much about Jewish belief. And so here is Maimonides' account, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'll conclude by going through this list, and you can review the remaining slides on your own for Friday. So first, the first article of Moses ben Maimon, or Maimonides, is belief in the existence of the Creator who is perfect, right? Believe in God, in Hashem, Yahweh, that God is absolute and unparalleled, or he's of absolute and unparalleled unity. So he's emphasizing unity here because, as we'll learn next week, Christians believe that God is a Trinity, that he consists of three co-eternal, co-equal persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Maimonides and the Jews, along with the Muslims, believe God is one person, if we can use the word person, one being, right? Not three beings in one. God's non-corporeality. So here he's rejecting the notion of the incarnation. Again, Christians believe that God incarnates in Jesus on earth. Jews do not believe that. God's eternity, worship God alone and no foreign false gods. God communicates with man through prophets. And of course, the greatest prophet in Judaism is Moses, but there are lots of others. Number 7, the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, our teacher. So he's he's emphasizing this because, of course, in Islam, they recognize a later prophet, Muhammad, and that it's Muhammad's revelation, the revelation that Muhammad receives from God, the Quran, that supersedes the earlier one. So here Maimonides is saying, no, Moses is our teacher. Moses is the pinnacle of it all. The divine origin of the Torah, that's the revelation that Moses receives. The immutability of the Torah, that means that the Torah is perfect. It's not corrupted. Muslims would say that earlier revelations like the Torah get corrupted, so God has to speak again to a new prophet and has the Quran. So this is a kind of defensive Jewish belief against Islam. God's omniscience and providence, divine reward and punishment, the arrival of the Messiah in the Messianic era, right? So Jews are still awaiting the coming of the Messiah. This is Maimonides writing in the 13th century, and then the belief in the resurrection of the dead. So the belief that at the end of the world, everyone who ever lived will be resurrected in the body and judged for their actions. Now, this belief, this part of Judaism, is part of rabbinic Judaism, but if you went back to the first century and you looked at those different factions, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, but the Sadducees did not. The Sadducees, those were the priests in the temple, they rejected this belief. So you can see the continuity of the Pharisaic elements in the 13 articles of belief, according to Maimonides. All right, it's 11:50, I'm out of time. I will see you on Friday.